You know, for the last 2 years, 2.5 years, we've been inundated with this notion of the ubiquitous Russian, the Ruski, in your closet, under your cupboards. Vladimir Putin riding across the Atlantic Ocean on a bear, bareback, with his pecs showing. The bear swimming, in my mind anyway, with Lady Liberty looking ever so gently, not necessarily sure, but attracted to the pecs that are glistening in the sun. The media has told us that the Ruskies have been out to get us. Not just out to get us, that they've attacked democracy itself, that they've worked with Donald Trump to attack democracy. You've had some Democrats that question openly saying whether or not a hack or an association or something that the Ruskies have did equaled to an actual attack itself. Like, understand the language that they've been using when they've been describing what amounts to a conspiracy theory. In order to legitimize this conspiracy theory, almost to give legitimacy to the feebleness of this case, they've indicted a Russian woman on charges of putting Facebook and Twitter ads with the idea of fomenting a certain degree of resentment. The reality of this is that when the United States seeks to create conflict or seeks to undermine governments in other countries, part of the way they use that is information warfare through media. So you can understand that the United States feels or is aware and somewhat sensitive about that. Not to mention, from the standpoint of the United States, the individuals that are in the United States, particularly in the government, looks at this as our domain. Only we can adversely affect other countries. Only we can topple other countries. But the fact of the matter is, they've demonstrated none of this. The idea of Trump and Russia was, for all intents and purposes, a conspiracy theory, and Politico has put out a story saying, prepare to be disappointed. The thing is, it's not the Ruskies that are out to get you on this front. I'm not necessarily shocked, or I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if other governments, just like our government, sought to influence the affairs in foreign governments. That's what governments do. Governments have always done that. And the information that is put out, even by their own standards, was kind of all over the place to create a certain degree of resentment, not necessarily to elect a particular candidate. That said, there are more direct attacks to the democratic process. We have never been a United States of America. We've always been to some degree divided. There's always been conflicts. Lenin in State and Revolution described this idea of government, the edifice that is put into power, is a way to mitigate the competing interests of the classes. You can break that up into more than just classes, but also this thing of races. Now, I would argue that race is an issue of class because I don't necessarily think race exists, even though I guess you can say it exists just in a way that people have given life to it. A separate point. I'm just making the point that there's always been divisions within the society itself. In a schoolboy way, in this kind of philosophical idea of democracy or representative government, one man, one woman, one vote. Despite our disagreements, we bitch, we move, we rattle, we gesticulate. We try to get people over to our particular side. We try to make our case. We try to get them to agree with us so all of us can cobble ourselves together into somewhat of a union and move the country in a direction. Now, there are factions that are small, there are factions that are larger. But ultimately the goal, at least in this schoolboy, philosophical, democratic, representative government way, is the group that has the largest contingent of people goes. In reality, however, that's not necessarily how that works. Despite all of this talk about the Russians and everything else, the reality of it is there are factions within the country itself that actively seek to inhibit, suppress, and stop individuals from voting, particularly when those individuals are voting in ways that they don't particularly like and that adversely affect their particular interests. For example, even back during the Bush administration, when the Bush won that race, you had all sorts of African Americans pushing for Al Gore, looking for one Democratic senator that would justify a review of the election. Because what they understood was there were thousands of African Americans that didn't get the opportunity to vote. And that's not just in Florida. And that's not just in that election. That's both parties that behave in this way, that do things that are gaming the process. Right now, as we speak, take a look at this. Georgia voters. We have people getting turned away at early voting because the address on their ID doesn't match. We find ways to exclude people from the voting process. Look at this. In the past 2 years, Florida has purged more than 7% of its voters. Georgia has purged more than 10.6%. North Carolina has purged more than 11.7%. This gets worse. This goes everything, and again, both parties. Republicans have taken this to a fine art form, but in the last presidential primary, Democrats did the exact same thing, shutting down polling locations in areas where they believed that the people were going to be disadvantageous. In a state cross-check, where they would eliminate certain people based on racial demographics because they knew those demographics will vote more so Democrat. And if we're talking about things that change or affect the election, I guarantee you, as opposed to Facebook and Twitter ads, cutting down the number of people that have the potential to vote will directly affect the voter total. Greg Palast has done a lot of work on this. Where his argument is the election was stolen. Trump's victory margin in Michigan, 13,000. Michigan cross-check purge list, 444,000. Trump victory margin in Arizona, 85,000. Arizona cross-check purge list, 270,000. Trump margin of victory in North Carolina, 177,000. North Carolina cross-check purge list, 589,000. Eligible voters, mind you. All states purge their list to some degree, but the arguments that they've been using to purge the list go well and beyond that. Especially with the destruction of the Voter Rights Act. The moment that the Voter Rights Act fell, that southern states took that as a carte blanche red light or green light to essentially purge, to change and contort voter laws. Because at that point, the government of the United States was no longer in a position to monitor the behavior of those states. We actively, in this country, tried to prevent people from voting. Hundreds of thousands of people were thrown off the rolls in Brooklyn. The consequence for that was little to none, a slap on the wrist. And then in the very next election, another fuck up where all of these people going to vote, eligible voters, not able to vote. And that's already with the draconian voting regulations that they have for voting in the primaries in New York. Arizona, where they were closing down voting locations and people were corralled into a small space. And I'm talking about the primaries in this case. The Democratic primary that was outright stolen, I believe in Nevada, with the delegate stuff. We actively find ways to screw over voters in this country and make it difficult for people to do the most basic thing in the world. One man, one woman, one vote. Don't tell me about the goddamn Russians if you're excluding people from voting. Not to mention felons, by the way. You know, we have millions of people who serve their time, get out of prison, and depending upon the state that they're in, no longer have the capacity to vote. Florida being one of those cases, Iowa being one of those cases. You have millions of people who are in Florida who've lost their right to vote. At this point, law-abiding citizens, they've served their time and yet don't have the right to vote. In Tim Canova's case, Tim Canova, running in Florida, wanted to check the results of the election because people were telling him that there was something fishy about it. Ballots destroyed. No consequence for the destruction of ballots, even though it's against the law. We do things where we're messing around with the way people go about their affairs in regards to the most basic, or should be one of the most basic civic duties of them all: the right to vote. We make it difficult. And in some states, we make it damn near impossible. This doesn't even get to this idea of gerrymandering, where you would have, at this point, Republicans changing the districts in a way that insulates themselves, making it harder to get them out of office because they've insulated themselves with their own voters. So a situation like, let's take North Carolina, for example. I think it's North Carolina. Pennsylvania, I'm sorry. Back in 2012, look at this district. They shaped this district in this way to insulate the certain people who were in that district that were Republicans. Part of the reason that you got this batshit crazy Republican House was because they were insulated, allowing them to be batshit crazy. The House Republicans won 49% of Pennsylvania's popular vote. They won 72% of its seats. And in 2014, the party breakdown of the state houses stayed exactly the same. They were insulated in the voting process. That's not the goddamn Russians. None of that is the goddamn Russians. All of that are things that people are doing, politicians in this country, in our country of the United States, where we're supposed to be united, where we're supposed to be all, regardless of us bitching and arguing and moaning and gesticulating, at the end of the day, still under this idea of what it means to be an American. One man, one woman, one vote. It's not the Russians that is making it difficult to vote. You may say that these guys are putting out Facebook and Twitter ads. And if that's what you want to use to saying that they were attacking democracy, fair enough. I think that's comical, somewhat sad, a bit hysterical, sour grapes. But the reality of it is, if you're blocking people from voting, if you're moving voting precincts, if you're closing voting precincts, if you're outright stealing the vote in places like Arizona, Nevada, if you're arbitrarily creating longer lines so some people will just leave because those people have to work, if you're not allowing people the day off so they can vote, this country makes it difficult to do the most basic of processes. Don't tell me about the goddamn Russians when this country actively takes steps to stop people from doing the most basic of things: voting in the election. Let's see who's here. I don't think anybody will be here this early. Baltazar is here. If a nightclub, jack-off comedians, actress, and Russians can sway elections, I fucked up by settling for an American voter Twitter activist. Well, according to them, a bunch of hackers or a bunch of Facebook and Twitter trolls had more influence than all of the campaign ads that Hillary Clinton was running, all of the media organizations that said vote for Hillary Clinton, all of the television spots, all of the spots where these guys were at stadiums and jumping in and out of states. All of that media attention was supposedly drowned out by, what, $50,000 in Facebook and Twitter ads, half of which that took place after the election. This stuff is nonsense. It's nonsense. Zalix, why are you capitalists picking on Russians all the time? Rob Illinois, Jamal, regardless of the physical voting changes, it doesn't matter if corporations own the general election systems.